the time comes when a father must say goodbye. His daughter wants to experience the freedom of the open road. For months, she calls home every week. Then suddenly, her calls stop. It's her father's worst fear, one that sends him on the hardest journey of his life. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours. In a northern Ontario town, detectives meet with a man named David Lopez. He has come all the way from Oregon to search for his 21-year-old daughter Melody and her boyfriend Sean Barrett. David Lopez has reason to believe the two of them were staying at a cabin near Sault Ste. Marie just before they disappeared.
In his heart of hearts, he was 100% certain that something bad had happened. David was very determined. He struck me as the type of individual that would not let something go.
David says Melody left home several months ago to backpack across North America.
He really didn't have a problem with Melody and her travels. He didn't seem to fear anything out there like a lot of parents would when their kids are out there traveling around.
David assumed his daughter was safe. She was traveling with her boyfriend. She called home every week.
They had a schedule where she would call and say, well, here's where we are today, here's our plan for tomorrow.
Police wonder if Melody simply got distracted and forgot to call. David insists his daughter wouldn't do something like that. The last time they spoke, she and Sean had some good news.
They had decided that it was time to take the trip home to Oregon, and they had discovered that Melody was pregnant. And it was ultimately the decision that it was time to settle down and raise a family. David was very excited to become a grandfather.
But Melody and Sean never came home. There were no more calls either.
As a parent, I'm sure he's sitting there waiting for the phone to ring at the usual hour when Melody would call. No contact, no phone calls, no messages left for him, either at work or at home.
6 weeks went by before David got any news. A young man named Chris came by the house looking for Melody and Sean. He had been traveling with them and was surprised to hear they hadn't come home. David wanted to know where Chris last saw Melody and Sean.
Chris advised David that they were picked up on the highway north of Toronto by an individual named Robert Armstrong. He offered them a ride to Sault Ste. Marie, so they figured that it would be best to take the ride through to Sault Ste. Marie, where they would have a better opportunity to pick the train heading westbound.
On the way up to Sault Ste. Marie, Robert Armstrong invited the three travelers to spend the night at his cabin. It was his little brother Richard's birthday.
When they arrived the first evening, Robert, Richard, Melody, Sean, and Chris began partying and celebrating Richard's birthday. All friendly, very easygoing, very relaxed.
Chris tells David the party soon got out of control.
Not long into the partying, Robert brought out a handgun, a .45 caliber Colt, and they began shooting the gun.
Chris says Robert Armstrong's behavior worried him, but he let it go. The police have heard enough. They know what the Armstrongs are capable of.
The Armstrong family had a very violent history and were very well known by the police as living outside the bounds of the law.
The police need to find out what's going on at the Armstrong cabin. They ask David to return to his motel.
David was headstrong. He wanted to go to the cabin as well. He felt maybe Robert Armstrong had been holding her hostage. But due to the history of the Armstrong family, David attending at the cabin was not allowed.
When police arrive at the cabin, they find Richard Armstrong home alone. They ask for his brother's whereabouts. Richard says Robert left weeks ago to work in southern Ontario. Police then ask about Melody and her traveling companions.
Richard denied having any knowledge of the girl, denied having any knowledge of Sean or any knowledge of Chris. None of them had ever been there. There was no evidence from Richard that there had been any involvement with the Armstrongs and Melody or Sean.
The police have no way of corroborating what David Lopez has told them. They go to David's motel to deliver the news.
David was advised that there was no information and no evidence to support the fact that they had been there or that they were there now.
All the police can do is promise to call David if they hear any news about his daughter.
David was very upset with that, feeling as though he had been let down by the police community.
David Lopez refuses to give up his search. He's convinced the Armstrongs are involved in Melody's disappearance.
It was completely consuming his life. Everything that he was doing on a day-to-day basis was based on the search for his daughter.
David goes to a nearby U.S. border crossing. He posts Melody's picture there in the hope someone will remember seeing her. The customs officer doesn't recognize Melody, but he is able to identify Sean. David Lopez now has information that may help the police locate his daughter. Sault Ste. Marie detectives have no new leads in the disappearance of Melody Lopez and her boyfriend Sean Barrett. But when Melody's father David returns to the station, he's eager to tell them what he has just learned.
When David attended at the border with the missing persons poster, he was telling his story to anyone that would listen. As fate would have it, the customs officer had dealt with the Armstrongs, Sean Barrett, and Chris.
The customs officer says he stopped them 6 weeks ago when they tried to re-enter Canada after buying alcohol in the U.S.
What had happened was when they got into the American side, picked up their booze, and attempted to come back into Canada, Chris was denied entry because of a minor trespassing charge that he had on his record. So he was deported back into the States. The information that David received at the border was the first concrete link, the first evidentiary piece of information that he had to link the Armstrong family to his daughter, Sean and Chris.
Police now believe Richard Armstrong has not told them the whole story. 72 hours into the investigation, they pay him another visit.
Parked a cruiser and walked into the cabin and knocked on the door to find Richard still there alone. Richard appeared to be nervous. He appeared to be frozen, just numb. Immediately upon us entering, he said, "Oh, by the way, I meant to tell you, I do remember Melody being here." And Richard started with this tale of how they had been there partying. They had consumed a large quantity of alcohol at that point. Richard detailed how his brother had done some slimy things. Robert had made some sexual advances toward Melody, and that being pregnant, Sean took offense to that. During the course of that altercation, the handgun came out.
Richard tells police Melody stopped the fight before it got out of control. She said it was time for them to go.
Richard advised that Robert had given them a ride out to the highway and sent them on their way. They were on their way westbound as their initial plans. Richard's demeanor led me to believe that there was more to the story than what he was telling us. I asked him point blank, "What would you say if I said that I think you killed them?" His chin started to quiver, and his lower lip, I could see his lip kind of swelling, and his eyes started welling up, and the next thing you know, he started yelling, okay, my brother killed them. He killed them and burnt their bodies in a fire.
Richard was living with such a guilty conscience. He just could not live keeping those secrets inside.
The detectives put Richard Armstrong in protective custody. They're worried what may happen to him once Robert finds out he has been talking to police.
Family members can turn on family members. It's happened many times in the past.
The police find Robert Armstrong in Windsor, Ontario. They place him under 24-hour surveillance, but they need evidence before they can make an arrest. The detectives then update David Lopez on the investigation.
We met with David Lopez and advised him that the case had been escalated from a missing person case to a homicide.
But no bodies have been found. David refuses to believe the young couple is dead.
I think David Lopez always had the strong hope that Melody and Sean were alive. I think he may have been thinking, as a lot of parents do, the kids are out somewhere. He never lost hope.
The following day, police secure the Armstrong property. They focus their attention on the fire pit in front of the cabin.
My first task was to ascertain whether or not there were cremated human remains. The fire pit was quite full, so as a result of that, I knew that we would have to go through this scene inch by inch.
On the fifth day of their search, forensic officers find what they're looking for: 2 small human bones.
This raises the level of the investigation to a new height, because now we're talking about the death of an individual that has been verified.
But to make a case for murder, police must now prove the bones belong to Melody or Sean.
All materials were brought back to my laboratory. You, of course, do want to get DNA samples, but DNA samples from forensic cremations is very dicey indeed. When you actually burn bone, you are drying it out. You are leaching things out of it, and they are combusting. And of course, DNA contained within those cells are being consumed by the fire.
The results lead nowhere.
There was no recoverable, analyzable DNA of any sort in the samples.
The investigation has reached a dead end. If police cannot prove Melody and Sean were murdered, their killer may go free. Police believe Robert Armstrong killed Melody Lopez and Sean Barrett, then burned their bodies. But they need proof before they can make an arrest. They turn to Robert's younger brother, Richard, for help.
Richard Armstrong was, in my estimation, living with a very shaky conscience. He was very uneasy, living with images in his mind of what he saw.
We asked him if he would accompany us back to the residence in order to show us through the scene where various pieces of evidence may be located.
As soon as Richard arrives at the family property, he leads police to the garage.
We found out that Richard actually had taken the gun and hidden it in one of the old vehicles that was located on the property.
Richard also explains why police have had such difficulty recovering the remains.
Once the fire had died down, Robert and Richard cleaned the fire pit out. Robert was quite concerned with the fact that there was large enough bones that could still be visible. The shovel was used to crush the bones that were still visible within the fire pit. After the bones were crushed, they were placed away from the cabin. These sites were all eventually shown to us by Richard when we did our walkthrough.
It's clear Richard was more involved in the murders than he at first let on.
Forensic team located not only human remains, but they located a large number of exhibits, buckles off of belts, buttons off of blue jeans, pack sack buckles, and so on and so forth.
They also find a bracelet.
This was the largest piece of jewelry or metal item that we actually found throughout the entire scene. This was very significant. As far as a personal item that had potential of being linked to a victim.
Police now have the proof they need to arrest Robert Armstrong.
A high-risk takedown was conducted. The officers had their weapons drawn. When an arrest of that fashion takes place, it's an overwhelming show of force on the part of the officers that are present.
Police also arrest Richard Armstrong as an accessory to murder. The story he told police in the first 72 hours of the investigation proved to be an accurate account of the night Melody and Sean were killed. After Melody broke up the fight between Robert and Sean, she decided it was time for bed. Richard escorted her up to the cabin.
Once they got back to the cabin, the information that we were able to gather was that another fight ensued.
There were words exchanged between Robert Armstrong and Sean Barrett with respect to his girlfriend, Melody. That escalated into more than just a verbal argument.
Melody was asleep. Richard was not.
We will never know what led to the first shot. After Sean was killed, Robert took Sean's body and placed it on the bonfire that was going. As a result of his actions, he was forced to eliminate the only link that was remaining, which was Melody.
Robert woke Melody up and told her Sean wanted to speak to her.
She came outside. It was now completely dark. Robert directed Melody towards the campfire.
When she looked down, she saw Sean's body burning in the flames.
Robert drew his revolver.
Melody begged for her life and the life of her unborn child.
Robert effectively executed Melody and shot her in the head. After shooting her, he placed her body on the fire.
Robert then made his younger brother an accessory to murder.
The Armstrongs not only cremated the bodies, they destroyed any evidence that Melody, Sean, or Chris had ever been there.
But one piece of evidence refused to burn. When the detectives present the bracelet to David Lopez, he knows it can only mean one thing.
David kept going from the day that he learned his daughter hadn't shown up in Oregon till the day he was told that his daughter had been murdered. It had an inscription embossed right into the bracelet, and we discovered that the inscription was in relation to the god of travel, the protector of travelers. And Melody wore the bracelet everywhere she went. He had lost his daughter and his future son-in-law and his future grandchild.
Robert Armstrong was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Unable to cope with his guilt, Richard Armstrong tried to hang himself. He suffered brain damage and was declared unfit to stand trial.
Homicide happens, and in this case, for no reason at all. Just a senseless act supported by alcohol, craziness. It's just a total tragedy all around.
As a father, it's made me want to hold on to my kids a lot tighter. Sure makes me realize how fragile life is, and you got to hold on to what you have every day.
The stories on 72 Hours are true. The detectives and forensic scientists are the ones who actually worked on the case.